In the bitter winter of 1847, a revelation surfaced in the quiet river town of Millbrook, Kentucky, one that would cast a long shadow over the Ohio River Valley for generations to come. Beneath the walls of the highly regarded Sullivan Medical Institute, investigators uncovered a concealed labyrinth of underground rooms. Inside lay the preserved bodies of more than 60 townspeople, men, women, even children who had disappeared over the previous 15 years without explanation. Alongside the remains were journals penned in the precise, elegant script of Dr. Cornelius Sullivan himself. Page after page detailed surgical procedures so extreme and invasive that even the most hardened physicians of the era struggled to comprehend them. These were not treatments born of desperation or emergency. What unsettled investigators most was the knowledge that many of the victims had walked into Sullivan's clinic under their own power, seeking relief from ordinary complaints, persistent headaches, digestive discomfort, insomnia, ailments that should never have led to the brutal interventions described in his notes. The full findings never reached the public. The Kentucky State Medical Board quietly sealed the report, consigning the true extent of Sullivan's work to locked archives and official silence. For nearly 2 centuries, the horrors committed beneath the Institute remained buried, both literally and historically. This secrecy was made even more disturbing by the Sullivan family's reputation. Since Millbrook's founding in 1823, the name Sullivan had been synonymous with care, learning, and healing. The town itself rested along a gentle curve of the Ohio River, a modest but thriving stop where steamboats docked to load tobacco and grain destined for New Orleans, an unremarkable place until the truth beneath it came to light. By 1832, the town boasted nearly 800 residents, most of them hardworking farmers, merchants, and river workers who had carved out respectable lives along the fertile bottomlands. The community took pride in its brick courthouse, its Methodist church with the tallest spire for 50 miles, and most especially its medical institute. Dr. Cornelius Sullivan had arrived in Millbrook in 1831, a distinguished gentleman in his early 42nds with silver-streaked hair and the kind of confident bearing that immediately commanded respect. He claimed to have studied at the finest medical colleges in Philadelphia and Edinburgh, carrying with him an impressive collection of surgical instruments and medical texts that few frontier doctors could afford. Within months of his arrival, he had established the Sullivan Medical Institute in a grand 3-story brick building on Main Street, complete with private patient rooms, a modern surgical theater, and what he called his research laboratory in the basement. The townspeople marveled at Dr. Sullivan's progressive approaches to medicine. Unlike the circuit doctors who relied on bloodletting and purging, Sullivan spoke of revolutionary treatments based on anatomical investigation and direct neural intervention. He treated ailments that other physicians declared hopeless, often taking patients into his institute for extended observation periods. His success rate seemed miraculous. Chronic pain disappeared, mental disturbances calmed, mysterious illnesses resolved completely. Sullivan lived quietly in rooms above his institute with his teenage daughter Margaret, a pale girl who assisted with his medical practice and rarely ventured into town social circles. The doctor explained that his wife had died in a yellow fever epidemic in New Orleans, and that his dedication to medicine stemmed from his inability to save her. The community respected his grief and admired his commitment to preventing such tragedies for other families. What Millbrook's residents didn't question was why so many of Dr. Sullivan's most remarkable recoveries involved patients from neighboring counties, drifters, itinerant workers, and troubled individuals whose disappearances might not be immediately noticed or investigated by local authorities. The first hint that something was amiss came in late October 1846 when Thomas Hricks, a respected tobacco merchant, approached Sheriff Benjamin Carmichael with a disturbing question. Chris's younger brother, Robert, had been suffering from severe headaches and episodes of confusion following a fall from his horse the previous spring. Dr. Sullivan had recommended a 2-week treatment program at the Institute, assuring the family that Robert would emerge completely cured. That was 6 weeks ago, Sheriff Hendricks said, his weathered hands trembling as he spoke. Every time I ask about Robert, Dr. Sullivan tells me the treatment is progressing well, but I haven't been allowed to see him, not once. He says the therapy requires complete isolation from family influences. Sheriff Carmichael, a practical man who had known the Hendricks family for decades, decided to pay an unannounced visit to the Medical Institute. When he arrived that gray November morning, he found Dr. Sullivan in his office, calmly reviewing patient files by lamplight. The physician greeted him with his usual professional courtesy, explaining that Robert was resting comfortably, but remained too delicate for visitors. I understand your concern, Sheriff, but premature family contact could reverse months of progress. The mind is a fragile instrument, requiring careful recalibration, perhaps in another week or two. But Carmichael had noticed something that made his stomach tighten with unease. Through the partially open door to the hallway, he could see Margaret Sullivan mopping the floor near the basement stairs. The water in her bucket was tinged with a rusty brown color that looked disturbingly like dried blood, and the harsh smell of lye couldn't quite mask an underlying odor of decay that seemed to seep up from the building's lower level. That evening, Sheriff Carmichael returned to the Institute after dark, this time without announcing his arrival. The building appeared empty except for a faint light glowing in the basement windows. Moving carefully around to the rear of the structure, he discovered a small ground-level window that provided a limited view into the basement laboratory. What he saw in that narrow frame of lamplight would plague his sleep for the rest of his life. Dr. Sullivan stood over an examination table wearing a blood-stained leather apron, methodically making incisions in what appeared to be human tissue. The table was surrounded by glass containers filled with preserved organs. Detailed anatomical charts covered the walls, and in the shadows beyond the lamplight, Carmi. Chale could make out the shapes of several more examination tables, each occupied by a still form covered with white sheets. The sheriff's hands shook as he realized that the figure on Sullivan's table bore the distinctive red hair and stocky build of Robert Hriss. Word of Sheriff Carmichel's discovery spread through Millbrook like wildfire, but the initial reaction was not what he had expected. Rather than outrage, many townspeople expressed skepticism and concern for Dr. Sullivan's reputation. The physician had saved too many lives, cured too many ailments, and provided too much hope for the community to readily accept such horrific accusations. Thomas Hendricks has been drinking heavily since his brother disappeared, whispered Mrs. Adelaide Prescott, the banker's wife, to her circle of friends. And everyone knows Sheriff Carmichael has been looking for an excuse to challenge Dr. Sullivan ever since the doctor questioned his handling of the cholera outbreak last summer. Dr. Sullivan himself appeared genuinely bewildered by the accusations when confronted by a hastily assembled town council. He explained that he had been conducting anatomical research using cadavers purchased from medical colleges in Louisville, and that Robert Hriss had unfortunately succumbed to a brain fever despite extensive treatment efforts. The body had been preserved pending notification of the family, though he admitted he had delayed the sad news, hoping for a medical breakthrough that might still save other patients with similar conditions. Gentlemen, I understand how disturbing this must appear to lay people unfamiliar with modern medical practices, Sullivan said, his voice heavy with what
seemed like genuine sorrow.
But I assure you that every procedure I have conducted has been in service of advancing our understanding of human anatomy and disease. If my methods appear unconventional, it is only because conventional medicine has failed so many patients who deserved better. The town council voted to allow Sullivan to continue his practice under increased oversight, requiring him to provide detailed records of all patients and their treatments. Most residents wanted to believe their trusted physician, and Sullivan's cooperation with the new requirement seemed to confirm his innocence, but Sheriff Carmichael was not satisfied. He had seen too much that night at the basement window, and Robert Hendricks' death marked the beginning of his own private investigation into the Sullivan Medical Institute. Over the following months, he began tracking patterns that the townspeople had overlooked or dismissed. Between 1832 and 1846, 37 patients had been admitted to Sullivan's Institute for extended treatment. Of these, only 14 had ever returned to their families. 23 had allegedly died during treatment. a mortality rate that would have been scandalous if the deaths had occurred within Millbrook proper. But most of Sullivan's deceased patients had been travelers, seasonal workers, or individuals from distant communities whose deaths were reported by letter to families who never visited Millbrook to verify the claims. Sheriff Carmichael also discovered that Dr. Sullivan had been corresponding with medical colleges in Louisville, Cincinnati, and even as far away as Baltimore, purchasing anatomy textbooks, surgical instruments, and supplies that seemed far beyond what a small-town physician would require. The doctor's financial records showed regular payments to mysterious suppliers listed only as research materials and anatomical specimens. Most disturbing of all, Carmichael found evidence that Sullivan had been advertising his services in newspapers throughout Kentucky and southern Indiana, specifically targeting individuals suffering from chronic conditions, mental disturbances, and ailments, deemed hopeless by conventional physicians. The advertisements promised revolutionary treatments based on the latest European medical advances and encouraged patients to plan for extended residential therapy at his fully equipped medical facility. As winter deepened into 1847, Sheriff Carmichael began receiving visits from families throughout the region, all sharing variations of the same heartbreaking story. A loved one had gone to Dr. Sullivan for treatment and had never returned home. Samuel Turner, a riverboat captain from Madison, Indiana, described how his 19-year-old son, David, had suffered from severe melancholia following the death of his fiancée. Local physicians had suggested rest and prayer, but Dr. Sullivan's advertisement in the Madison Courier promised specialized treatment for disorders of the mind and nervous system. David had traveled to Millbrook in August 1845, planning to stay 2 weeks. His father received one letter dictated to Dr. Sullivan explaining that the treatment was progressing well but required additional time. Then nothing. I came to Millbrook 3 times, Turner said, his weathered face creased with anguish. Each time Dr. Sullivan assured me David was improving but wasn't yet ready for visitors. He showed me letters, supposedly written by my son, but the handwriting didn't look quite right. When I demanded to see David, Sullivan claimed he had been transferred to a specialized facility in Louisville for advanced treatment. But I checked every hospital and asylum in Louisville. No one had ever heard of my son. Mrs. Elena Dawson from Bardstown had sent her 16-year-old daughter, Catherine, to Sullivan for treatment of what other doctors called female hysteria, severe headaches and fainting spells that had begun after Catherine witnessed a violent accident involving a runaway horse. Sullivan had promised that his neurological interventions could cure such conditions permanently. That was in June 1844. Mrs. Dawson had received 2 letters, supposedly from Catherine, describing her treatment progress. Then silence. The last letter talked about how much better she was feeling. Mrs. Dawson whispered, tears streaming down her cheeks. It said Dr. Sullivan was teaching her about anatomy and that she might become his assistant. But Catherine fainted at the sight of blood. She could never have assisted with medical procedures. Each family shared similar details. The hopeful departure, the reassuring initial letters, the gradual reduction in communication, and finally the devastating news that their loved one had either died during treatment or been transferred to another facility that could never be located. Sheriff Carmichael realized that Dr. Sullivan had created a perfect system for acquiring vulnerable patients. He targeted individuals whose conditions made them desperate for help, whose families lived far enough away to make regular visits impractical, and whose disappearances could be XP, laying through plausible medical narratives that discouraged further investigation. But Carmichael also suspected that Sullivan's operation was larger and more sophisticated than anyone imagined. The basement laboratory he had glimpsed represented only a small portion of what might be happening within the Institute's walls. The building was large enough to house extensive facilities, and Sullivan's daughter Margaret seemed to know more about her father's work than she was revealing to the community. On a bitter February night, Carmichael decided to conduct a more thorough investigation of the Sullivan Medical Institute, this time bringing along his deputy James Whitfield and Dr. Augustus Brennan, a retired Army surgeon who had recently settled in Millbrook and had expressed private concerns about Sullivan's methods. The three men approached the Institute at midnight, when the building appeared dark, except for the familiar glow from the basement windows, using a key that Carmichael had obtained from the building's original contractor. They entered through the rear service door and found themselves in a narrow hallway that led to the main floor examination rooms. The building felt wrong immediately. The air carried a chemical smell, formaldehyde mixed with something organic and putrid. The wooden floors were stained with dark spots that had been scrubbed but never completely cleaned. Most unsettling of all, they could hear sounds from below: metallic scraping, the clink of glass containers, and what might have been human voices speaking in low, urgent tones. "Doctor!" Brennan examined several of the first-floor patient rooms and found them equipped with restraining devices that seemed far too elaborate for conventional medical use. Iron manacles were bolted to the walls, and the windows had been fitted with bars that could only be opened from the outside. The beds featured leather straps designed to immobilize patients completely. "These aren't treatment rooms," Dr. Brennan whispered grimly. "They're prison cells." In Dr. Sullivan's office, Sheriff Carmichael discovered a locked cabinet containing detailed patient files that revealed the true scope of the physician's activities. Each file contained not just medical observations, but anatomical sketches, measurements of bone structure, and notes about experimental procedures that range from surgical removal of organs to what Sullivan termed cerebral mapping through direct tissue examination. The file for Robert Friss contained 17 pages of notes describing surgical procedures performed while the patient was allegedly conscious, including detailed observations of how different parts of the brain responded to direct stimulation. Sullivan had recorded Hendrick's verbal responses to various interventions, creating what appeared to be a systematic map of human consciousness and pain responses. But it was Margaret Sullivan's file that revealed the most horrifying truth about the Institute's operations. Unlike the other patients, Margaret's file was labeled Primary Research Assistant Subject M. The documents described how Sullivan had been using his own daughter as a test subject for various experimental procedures since her arrival in Millbrook. The pale, withdrawn girl who assisted with his medical practice had been systematically subjected to surgical modifications designed to test Sullivan's theories A-B, out human anatomy and psychology. The file contained detailed sketches of surgical scars on Margaret's body, notes about her responses to various drugs and chemicals, and plans for future procedures that Sullivan hoped would perfect the integration of surgical intervention with neurological function. It became clear that Margaret Sullivan wasn't just helping her father with his experiments. She was his most successful creation, a human being who had been systematically modified to serve his research needs. Deputy Whitfield discovered a hidden door behind a bookshelf in Sullivan's office, revealing a narrow staircase that led down to the basement laboratory. As the three men descended, the chemical smells grew stronger and they could hear more clearly the sounds of ongoing activity below. What they found in the basement laboratory exceeded their worst fears and challenged their understanding of how far a human being could descend into systematic evil. Just when we thought we'd seen it all, the horror in Millbrook intensifies. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries. Hit that like button to support our content, and don't forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. Let's discover together what happens next. The laboratory occupied the entire basement level of the Institute, divided into multiple chambers connected by narrow corridors. The main surgical suite contained 4 examination tables, each equipped with restraining devices and surrounded by glass cases filled with preserved human organs. The walls were covered with anatomical charts that showed human bodies divided into numbered sections along with detailed notes about optimal surgical approaches for accessing different organ systems. In the preservation chamber, Sheriff Carmichael counted 43 glass containers, each holding human organs suspended in chemical solutions. Many were labeled with dates and patient initials, creating a horrifying catalog of Sullivan's surgical activities over the past 15 years. Some containers held entire limbs, while others contained organs that had been dissected to show internal structures. The labels indicated that Sullivan had been systematically harvesting organs from living patients to study their function and structure. The most disturbing discovery was in what Sullivan had labeled his neurological research laboratory. This chamber contained 12 human heads, perfectly preserved in large glass containers with detailed charts showing how Sullivan had accessed and mapped different regions of each brain. The preservation process had maintained facial features, making it possible to identify several of the victims from descriptions provided by their families. David Turner's distinctive cleft chin was clearly visible, as was Catherine Dawson's dark hair arranged around her preserved face. Dr. Brennan was examining Sullivan's surgical notes when they heard footsteps on the stairs behind them. Dr. Cornelius Sullivan descended into the laboratory, carrying an oil lamp and wearing the same bloodstained leather apron that Carmichael had seen through the basement window months earlier. Behind him came Margaret Sullivan, moving with an odd mechanical precision that suggested her father's surgical modifications had affected her motor functions. "Gentlemen, I must say I'm disappointed," Sullivan said calmly, setting his lamp on the examination table. "I had hoped that Sheriff Carmichel's initial curiosity could be managed through conventional channels, but I see that more direct intervention is required." Margaret moved to block the stairway exit while Sullivan continued speaking in the same professional tone he used with patients upstairs. Her movements were fluid but somehow wrong, too controlled, as if every gesture required conscious effort rather than natural reflex. "You've discovered the extent of my research, and I imagine you're experiencing the typical emotional responses: shock, revulsion, moral indignation. But I want you to understand that everything you see here represents the advancement of medical knowledge that will ultimately benefit all humanity. Each patient who contributed to this research has participated in discoveries that will eliminate suffering for future generations." Sheriff Carmichael noticed that Sullivan's surgical instruments were laid out on a nearby table, suggesting that he had been preparing for another procedure when their intrusion interrupted his work. The tools were arranged with obsessive precision: scalpels, bone saws, clamps, and devices that seemed designed for procedures no legitimate physician would attempt. "Dr. Sullivan," Deputy Whitfield said, his voice steady despite the horror surrounding them, "these people came to you for help. They trusted you." Sullivan's eyes lit up with what appeared to be genuine enthusiasm, and what magnificent trust it was. "Do you realize how rare it is to find subjects willing to participate in truly groundbreaking research? Conventional medical colleges provide only cadavers, cold, lifeless tissue tea. That tells us nothing about the dynamic processes of living systems. But my patients offered something far more valuable: the opportunity to study human physiology, neurology, and psychology in real time." He moved to one of the preservation containers, gazing at the suspended organs with obvious pride. This liver came from a 43-year-old farmer who complained of chronic fatigue. Through careful surgical exploration while he remained conscious, I was able to map the relationship between hepatic function and energy levels with unprecedented precision. His contribution to medical science far exceeded anything he could have achieved through his mundane agricultural pursuits. Dr. Brennan stepped forward, trying to maintain professional composure. "Dr. Sullivan, what you're describing isn't medical research. It's systematic torture. These people suffered unimaginable agony. Dr. Brennan, your military background has exposed you to trauma, but you've never truly studied it." Sullivan replied, "Pain is simply a neurological response that can be modified through proper intervention. Watch." He gestured to Margaret, who immediately rolled up her sleeve, revealing a series of surgical scars along her forearm. Sullivan selected a small scalpel from his instrument collection and made a shallow incision across one of the existing scars. Margaret's face remained completely expressionless, showing no reaction to what should have been considerable pain. Through systematic modification of nerve pathways and careful application of chemical treatments, I've been able to eliminate Margaret's capacity for physical distress while maintaining her cognitive function. She represents 15 years of care, UL neurological research, and she's become the perfect medical assistant capable of complex procedures without the emotional limitations that handicap conventional physicians. Margaret spoke in her eerily calm voice. The initial procedures were uncomfortable, but Father explained that temporary discomfort was necessary to achieve optimal functionality. Now I can assist with extended surgical research without experiencing the emotional disturbances that might compromise scientific objectivity. Sheriff Carmichael realized they were listening to a young woman whose capacity for normal human emotion had been surgically removed by her own father. The pale, withdrawn girl who had seemed merely shy was actually the victim of medical experiments that had fundamentally altered her brain chemistry and neural responses. Sullivan continued his explanation with growing excitement. Margaret's modifications represent only the beginning of what's possible through direct neurological intervention. I've developed techniques for eliminating specific emotional responses while preserving intellectual capacity, methods for enhancing pain tolerance, and procedures that can fundamentally alter personality traits that might be considered undesirable. He moved to another section of the laboratory where Sheriff Carmichael could see additional examination tables equipped with restraining devices that appeared far more sophisticated than anything he had noticed initially. These tables featured mechanisms for precisely controlling a patient's position during surgery, along with apparatus designed to monitor vital signs throughout extended procedures. David Turner, the young man from Madison who suffered, D from Melancholia, provided extraordinary insights into the neurological basis of emotional disturbance, Sullivan explained. Consulting a leather-bound journal filled with meticulous handwriting, through systematic exploration of different brain regions, I was able to identify the specific neural pathways responsible for persistent sadness, and I developed surgical techniques for modifying those pathways to eliminate depressive responses permanently. You mean you performed brain surgery on a living conscious patient? Dr. Brennan said, his voice tight with controlled rage. I prefer the term neurological optimization, Sullivan replied, and yes, consciousness was essential for the research. How else could I determine which intervention successfully modified emotional responses? David remained alert throughout the procedures, providing detailed feedback about changes in his mental state as I systematically modified different regions of his brain. His contributions to neuroscience were immeasurable. Deputy Whitfield had been quietly examining the laboratory while Sullivan spoke, and he discovered something that made his blood run cold. In a corner chamber partially hidden by hanging curtains, he found additional examination tables, but these were currently occupied by living patients in various stages of surgical modification. Sheriff, he called softly, you need to see this. The hidden chamber contains 6 patients, all conscious but apparently unable to move or speak normally. Their heads had been partially shaved, revealing surgical incisions covered with fresh bandages. Each patient was secured to their examination table with leather restraints, and their eyes tracked Mo, vehement with expressions of desperate terror that their modified vocal cords could no longer articulate. Sullivan noticed their discovery and smiled with what appeared to be genuine pleasure. Ah, you found my current research subjects. These individuals represent a fascinating study in progressive neurological modification. Each is undergoing a different experimental protocol designed to test various theories about consciousness, pain perception, and behavioral control. He approached one of the tables, consulting notes attached to the patient's restraints. This gentleman complained of chronic insomnia when he arrived 3 weeks ago. I've been systematically modifying his sleep regulation centers to determine whether we can eliminate the need for sleep entirely. The results have been quite promising, though he's experienced some unexpected side effects in terms of cognitive function. The patient, a middle-aged man whose eyes showed clear awareness of his situation, attempted to speak, but only managed weak, incomprehensible sounds. Sullivan had apparently damaged his vocal cords during one of the experimental procedures. And this young lady, Sullivan continued, moving to another table, sought treatment for what she described as nervous disposition. I've been exploring whether surgical modification of the amygdala can eliminate anxiety responses while preserving other emotional capabilities. The process has required several iterative procedures, but I'm confident we're approaching a breakthrough. Sheriff Carmichael realized they had discovered Sullivan's operation while it was still actively continuing. These weren't just the preserved remains of past victims. They were witnessing NG ongoing torture disguised as medical research with patients who were still alive and suffering from procedures that had been continuing for weeks or months. Margaret Sullivan moved to one of the examination tables and began adjusting restraints with the same clinical detachment she might use to arrange medical instruments. Her father's modifications had eliminated not only her capacity for physical pain, but also her ability to feel empathy for the suffering of others. Margaret has become invaluable in managing extended research protocols. Sullivan explained she can monitor patients' vital signs, maintain surgical sites, and assist with procedures without experiencing the emotional complications that might interfere with scientific objectivity. She represents the future of medical practice. Physicians who can focus purely on research goals without being distracted by sentimentality about patient comfort. Dr. Brennan approached one of the conscious patients, a young woman whose terrified eyes pleaded for help despite her inability to speak or move normally. Her surgical wounds showed signs of repeated modification, suggesting that Sullivan had been performing multiple procedures over an extended period. "How long have you been keeping these people here?" Dr. Brennan demanded. Sullivan consulted his journals with obvious pride. "The longest-term subject has been participating in research for nearly 8 months. Her case has been particularly valuable because it's allowed me to study the long-term effects of progressive neurological modification. I've been able to systematically alter different aspects of her personality and cognitive function, creating a detailed map of how surgical interventions affect human consciousness." Though the woman Dr. Brennan was examining appeared to be in her early 20s with dark hair and delicate features that would have been beautiful before Sullivan's experiments began disfiguring her skull. Her medical chart hanging from the examination table identified her as subject N61 Catherine and contained detailed notes about surgical procedures that had been performed on various parts of her brain over the previous months. Catherine initially sought treatment for migraine headaches, Sullivan explained, but her case presented an excellent opportunity to study pain perception mechanisms. "I've been systematically modifying different neural pathways to determine which interventions can eliminate specific types of pain while preserving other sensory capabilities. Her contributions to our understanding of pain management will benefit countless future patients." Catherine's eyes showed clear awareness of her situation and desperate attempts to communicate, but Sullivan's procedures had damaged her ability to control facial muscles or vocal cords. She could see and hear everything happening around her, but she was trapped in a body that no longer responded to her conscious will. Sheriff Carmichael felt sick as he realized the full scope of what Sullivan had been doing. The doctor wasn't just killing patients, he was keeping them alive for extended periods while systematically experimenting on their brains, creating victims who remained conscious throughout procedures that gradually destroyed their ability to function as normal human beings. "The three of you represent interesting research opportunities," Sullivan mused, selecting surgical instruments from his collection. "Sheriff Carmichael, your community leadership experience would provide insights into the neurological basis of authority and decision-making. I've been particularly interested in exploring whether surgical modification could enhance leadership capabilities while eliminating inconvenient moral constraints." He moved toward Deputy Whitfield, examining him with the same clinical interest he might show toward a laboratory specimen.
"Deputy, your law enforcement background suggests excellent physical conditioning and stress tolerance.
You'd be ideal for research into pain threshold modification and behavioral control under extreme circumstances." Dr. Brennan backed away from Sullivan, but Margaret had positioned herself to block potential escape routes with movements that showed her father's training had extended far beyond medical assistance. Dr. Brennan, your military medical experience makes you particularly valuable. Sullivan continued, I've been developing surgical techniques that could enhance battlefield medicine by eliminating physicians' emotional responses to trauma. Imagine military surgeons who could work efficiently regardless of the severity of injuries they encounter, never distracted by sympathy for wounded soldiers. Sullivan's vision of medical progress involved creating physicians who had been surgically modified to eliminate empathy, fear, and moral constraints. Doctors who could perform any procedure deemed scientifically valuable without being hindered by concerns about patient suffering. The confrontation that followed revealed the full extent of Sullivan's psychological deterioration and the systematic nature of his crimes. When Sheriff Carmichael attempted to move toward the laboratory exit, Margaret Sullivan responded with trained precision, using medical instruments as weapons with the same clinical detachment she applied to surgical procedures. During the struggle, it became clear that Sullivan had trained his daughter not only to assist with medical procedures, but also to defend the laboratory against potential interference. Her movements were efficient and calculated, showing that her father had spent years conditioning her to view violence as simply another aspect of scientific research. Dr. Brennan managed to free Catherine from her restraints, but the young woman's modified nervous system prevented her from coordinating normal movement. Sullivan's experiments had left her conscious and aware, but unable to control her body effectively, creating a victim who could understand her situation, but couldn't act to improve it. Sullivan fought with desperate fury when he realized his life's work was threatened, but he continued explaining his research methods throughout the confrontation. Even while being physically restrained, he expressed frustration that intellectually limited individuals couldn't appreciate the scientific value of his discoveries and insisted that future physicians would vindicate his research approaches. You're destroying 15 years of unprecedented medical research, Sullivan shouted as Deputy Whitfield secured his restraints. These subjects have contributed to advances in neuroscience that your small minds cannot comprehend. Future generations will recognize this work as the foundation of truly scientific medicine. Margaret Sullivan required separate restraint. Her responses to capture showed the full horror of her father's modifications. She didn't experience fear, anger, or distress when detained. Instead, she calmly assessed the situation and began developing plans for continuing her father's research from memory, showing that Sullivan had successfully eliminated her capacity for normal emotional responses while preserving her intellectual function and medical training. The full investigation of the Sullivan Medical Institute required coordination between local authorities, state officials, federal marshals, and medical experts from universities throughout the region. The complexity of Sullivan's operation exceeded anything investigators had previously encountered, requiring specialized knowledge to understand both the scope of his crimes and the extent of his victims' injuries. Dr. Marcus Fitzgerald, the leading neurologist at the University of Louisville, spent 3 weeks examining Sullivan's research notes and attempting to understand the surgical techniques he had developed. Fitzgerald's preliminary report described procedures that represented a systematic exploration of human neurological function through methods that demonstrated both sophisticated medical knowledge and complete disregard for patient welfare. The final count of victims reached 89 individuals ranging in age from 14 to 67, representing families from across Kentucky, Indiana, Ohio, Tennessee, and as far away as Illinois and Virginia. Sullivan's advertising campaign had been more extensive than initially realized, reaching communities throughout the Ohio River Valley and attracting patients from distances that made family oversight impractical. Sullivan. Detailed records provided investigators with documentation of experimental procedures that spanned 17 years, beginning with relatively conventional treatments that gradually evolved into systematic torture disguised as medical research. His journals revealed a progression from genuine attempts at innovative medicine to pure scientific sadism. With each successful procedure encouraging more extreme experiments, the physician had developed an elaborate infrastructure for obtaining and managing victims, including correspondence with families designed to discourage visits forged letters supposedly written by patients, and detailed protocols for disposing of bodies when experimental subjects died during procedures. His operation showed planning and organization that suggested calculating intelligence rather than simple madness. Of the 6 patients found alive in Sullivan's laboratory, only 3 survived long enough to receive treatment from legitimate physicians. The extent of their neurological damage made recovery impossible. But their testimonies provided crucial evidence about Sullivan's methods and the systematic nature of his crimes. Catherine Morrison, the young woman who had sought treatment for migraine headaches, lived for 6 weeks after her rescue. During her lucid moments, she was able to communicate through written notes that described months of conscious surgery, during which Sullivan had systematically explored different regions of her brain while explaining his theories about pain, perception, and neurological function. Her notes, preserved in court records, provided the most detailed account of Sullivan's experimental procedures. He would cut into my head, While I remained awake, probing different areas while asking me to describe what I felt. When I cried or begged him to stop, he explained that my emotional responses were interfering with scientific objectivity. He said the pain was temporary, but the knowledge gained would benefit all humanity. Catherine's testimony revealed that Sullivan had used a combination of mechanical restraints and chemical treatments to keep patients conscious and aware during procedures while preventing them from resisting or escaping. His techniques allowed him to conduct extended experimental surgeries over periods of weeks or months, gradually modifying different aspects of brain function while documenting the results. Thomas Beckwith, a 34-year-old miller from Brandenburg who had sought treatment for chronic back pain, survived with partial cognitive function. His testimony described how Sullivan had promised to eliminate pain through neurological modification, but had instead spent months systematically damaging different parts of his nervous system while testing theories about pain transmission and sensory processing. He told me that conventional medicine only treats symptoms, but his methods could eliminate pain permanently by modifying the brain's response mechanisms. Beckwith wrote in his statement, "Each procedure was supposed to be the final treatment, but there was always another area he wanted to explore, another theory he wanted to test. I realized he wasn't trying to cure my back pain. He was using me to study how the human brain processes physical sensation." The third survivor, 17-year-old Elizabeth Harden from Owensboro, had been brought to Sullivan by her parents seeking treatment for what they described as melancholic episodes. Her testimony revealed that Sullivan had been particularly interested in experimenting on younger patients because their brain tissue was more resilient and could survive procedures that would kill older subjects. Elizabeth's written account described watching Sullivan perform similar experiments on other patients while explaining his theories about emotional regulation and personality modification. He said that sadness and fear were simply neurological malfunctions that could be corrected through proper surgical intervention. He believed he could create people who would never experience negative emotions, who would be perfectly optimized for productive social function. Margaret Sullivan posed the most complex challenge for investigators and medical experts. Dr. Fitzgerald's examination revealed that her father had performed numerous surgical procedures on her brain and nervous system over a period of many years, fundamentally altering her neurological function in ways that medical science couldn't reverse or fully understand. Ms. Sullivan represents perhaps the most extensive case of systematic neurological modification ever documented. Dr. Fitzgerald reported to the court, her father appears to have used her as a long-term experimental subject, systematically eliminating various emotional and psychological responses while preserving intellectual capacity and motor function. The result is a human being who can function intellectually but lacks the normal emotional responses that guide moral behavior. Margaret's testimony provided the most comprehensive account of Sullivan's research methods, but her modified psychological state meant she described horrific procedures with clinical detachment, showing no awareness that the activities she detailed constituted criminal behavior rather than legitimate scientific research. Father began modifying my neurological responses when I was approximately 8 years old. She testified in a calm, emotionless voice. The initial procedures focused on pain elimination and anxiety reduction to improve my effectiveness as a research assistant. Later modifications addressed emotional responses that might interfere with scientific objectivity, including sympathy for research subjects and moral concerns about experimental protocols. Her testimony revealed that Sullivan had essentially created a human being who could assist with torture and murder without experiencing normal psychological distress. Margaret had helped restrain patients, monitor their vital signs during experimental procedures, and dispose of bodies when subjects died, all while viewing these activities as routine aspects of medical research. The legal proceedings against Dr. Sullivan extended over 8 months, during which prosecutors presented evidence of crimes that challenged existing legal frameworks. The systematic nature of his operation, the extended suffering of his victims, and the sophisticated methods he used to avoid detection represented a type of criminality that few courts had previously encountered. Sullivan's defense attorney argued that his client's actions, while misguided, were motivated by genuine scientific curiosity rather than criminal intent. This defense required the court to consider whether experimental medical procedures could constitute murder, even when conducted by someone with legitimate medical credentials. Sullivan himself showed no remorse during the trial, using his testimony to explain his research methods and defend the scientific value of his discoveries. He expressed frustration that legal proceedings were interfering with medical research that he claimed would ultimately benefit humanity, and he insisted that his patients had contributed to advances in neuroscience that justified their suffering. The subjects who participated in my research have advanced human understanding of neurological function in ways that conventional medicine could never achieve, Sullivan declared during his final statement to the court. Their sacrifices will be vindicated when future physicians use the knowledge gained through this research to eliminate suffering for countless patients. The jury convicted Sullivan on 87 counts of murder in the first degree, making his case one of the most extensive serial murder trials in American legal history. The judge sentenced him to death, though Sullivan used his remaining months to write detailed memoirs describing his research methods and expressing hope that future scientists would continue his work. Sullivan's memoirs, which filled over 400 pages of meticulous handwriting, provided additional evidence of his systematic approach to acquiring and experimenting on victims. He had maintained detailed financial records showing payments to suppliers throughout the region who provided chemicals, surgical instruments, and other materials needed for his research operations. His correspondence revealed connections with medical suppliers in Louisville, Cincinnati, Baltimore, and even New York, suggesting that his operation had required support from individuals who may have known or suspected the true nature of his research. Several suppliers had provided chemicals and equipment that would have been unusual for a small-town physician, raising questions about whether others had knowingly assisted his crimes. The investigation also revealed that Sullivan had been in correspondence with physicians and medical researchers throughout the United States, sharing selected findings from his experimental work while concealing the methods used to obtain his data. Some of his letters suggested that other physicians were conducting similar research, raising disturbing questions about how widely such practices might have spread within the medical community. Federal authorities expanded their investigation to examine other physicians who had corresponded with Sullivan or who had acquired similar supplies and equipment. This broader investigation identified at least 3 other medical practitioners who appeared to be conducting unauthorized experimental procedures on patients, suggesting that Sullivan's operation was part of a larger pattern of medical crimes that had escaped detection. Dr. Edmund Forrester of Nashville had been in regular correspondence with Sullivan and had purchased similar laboratory equipment and chemical supplies. When authorities investigated Forrester's practice, they discovered preserved human organs and surgical notes that suggested he had been conducting unauthorized post-mortem examinations and possibly experimental procedures on living patients. Dr. William Chandler of Lexington had received detailed letters from Sullivan describing neurological modification techniques, and his own patient records showed an unusually high mortality rate among individuals seeking treatment for minor ailments. Chandler's practice was closed pending investigation, though he died of a heart attack before formal charges could be filed. The most disturbing discovery involved Dr. Harrison Blackstone of Louisville, whose correspondence with Sullivan included discussions of techniques for optimizing human neurological function through surgical intervention. Blackstone had been operating a private hospital that advertised treatment for mental disturbances and neurological disorders, accepting patients from throughout Kentucky and Indiana. When authorities investigated Blackstone's facility, they found evidence of experimental procedures similar to those conducted by Sullivan. Though Blackstone had been more careful about maintaining the appearance of legitimate medical practice, his patients' families had received regular updates about treatment progress, and his mortality rates were not obviously suspicious. However, examination of Blackstone's records revealed Patterns Company, insistent with experimental research rather than therapeutic treatment. Many patients had undergone multiple surgical procedures that seemed designed to test theoretical approaches rather than address their original medical complaints. The discovery of these additional cases suggested that Sullivan's operation was part of a network of physicians who were using their medical credentials to conduct unauthorized human experimentation. The full extent of this network was never completely determined, but evidence suggested that such practices were more widespread than authorities had initially realized. Margaret Sullivan spent the remainder of her life in the Kentucky State Hospital for the Insane, where physicians struggled to understand the extent of the surgical modifications her father had performed on her brain. The hospital's medical director, Dr. Samuel Patterson, worked with specialists from several universities to study her condition and develop treatment approaches for victims of similar experimental procedures. Ms. Sullivan's case presents unprecedented challenges for medical treatment. Dr. Patterson reported her father's modifications have eliminated normal emotional responses while preserving intellectual function and memory. She can provide detailed information about medical procedures and demonstrate complex skills, but she appears incapable of understanding why her actions might be considered morally problematic. Margaret lived until 1903, never showing signs of normal emotional development, but occasionally providing medical researchers with insights into neurological function that advanced legitimate understanding of the human brain. Her case became the subject of extensive medical literature, contributing to early developments in neuroscience while serving as a cautionary example of how medical knowledge could be perverted for criminal purposes. The Sullivan Medical Institute building was destroyed by fire in March 1847, though local residents reported that the basement laboratory proved extraordinarily difficult to eliminate completely. The chemical preservation method Sullivan had used created fires that burned with unusual colors and produced toxic smoke that forced the town to evacuate temporarily. Even after the fire, the site remained problematic. The chemical residue Sullivan had used in his preservation processes had contaminated the soil, preventing normal vegetation growth and creating health hazards for anyone who spent extended time in the area. The town eventually declared the site unusable and prohibited construction on the contaminated ground. The families of Sullivan's victims faced the additional tragedy of learning detailed information about how their loved ones had suffered during the final months or years of their lives. Sullivan's meticulous record-keeping meant that parents, spouses, and siblings could read exact descriptions of the experimental procedures their family members had endured. Many families chose to relocate rather than remain in communities where they might encounter people who had trusted and defended Dr. Sullivan. The stigma associated with having been deceived by such an elaborate criminal operation created additional suffering for families who were already grieving the loss of their loved ones. Samuel Turner, the riverboat captain, whose son David had been one of Sullivan's victims, spent his remaining years advocating for medical oversight and patient protection laws. His testimony before the Kentucky legislature contributed to the development of regulations requiring review of experimental medical procedures and mandatory reporting of patient deaths. My son trusted Dr. Sullivan because he was desperate for help and because the community had accepted Sullivan's credentials and reputation. Turner testified, "We must ensure that no other families suffer because physicians are allowed to operate without adequate oversight or accountability. No. The Kentucky State Medical Board used the Sullivan case to establish comprehensive new regulations governing experimental medical procedures, requiring approval from medical review boards and mandatory reporting of any research involving human subjects. These regulations served as a model for other states and contributed to the development of modern medical ethics standards. However, the full details of Sullivan's research methods remained sealed in state archives for over a century, with officials arguing that public disclosure of his techniques might inspire copycat crimes or provide information that could be misused by other potentially dangerous physicians. Millbrook never recovered from the scandal associated with the Sullivan case. The town's population declined steadily as residents moved away, businesses closed, and the community's reputation made it difficult to attract new settlers or investment. By 1860, most of the buildings on Main Street stood empty, and the town's population had fallen to fewer than 200 residents. The site where the Sullivan Medical Institute had operated remained vacant for decades. WI local residents reporting that the ground remained stained and discolored despite repeated attempts at remediation. Nothing would grow in the soil where the building had stood, and animals avoided the area completely. Local folklore developed around the abandoned site, with residents reporting unusual odor, strange sounds, and a persistent feeling of unease that affected anyone who spent time near the former institute location. While these reports were likely psychological responses to the trauma associated with Sullivan's crimes, they contributed to the area's reputation and discouraged any attempts at redevelopment. The Sullivan case demonstrated how a combination of medical authority, community trust, systematic deception, and geographic isolation could enable sustained criminal activity on a massive scale. Dr. Sullivan had exploited the desperate hope of families seeking medical miracles, the limited communication systems of the 1840s, and the lack of oversight governing medical practice to create opportunities for crimes that continued, undetected, for nearly 2 decades. The case also revealed how professional credentials and community standing could provide cover for criminal activity, making it difficult for authorities to investigate suspicious behavior when it involved respected community members. Sullivan's reputation as a skilled healer had made it nearly impossible for families to voice concerns about their missing loved ones without appearing to question the judgment of a trusted medical professional. Contemporary medical historians often point to the Sullivan case as a chilling illustration of what can happen when medicine operates without ethical supervision or meaningful accountability. It stands as an early warning of how easily systematic abuse can take root in clinical environments when authority goes unquestioned. In the years that followed, the scandal influenced the slow development of informed consent standards, medical review committees, and regulations governing experimental treatment, principles that now form the backbone of modern medical ethics. Equally significant were the psychological evaluations conducted during Sullivan's trial. These early profiles offered rare insight into how an individual could engage in long-term criminal behavior while maintaining a convincing facade of professionalism and social respectability. For pioneering criminologists and psychologists, the case became a key study in understanding how seemingly ordinary people could commit sustained acts of cruelty without the moral restraints most humans possess. At its core, this mystery serves as a stark reminder of the danger in placing blind trust in authority figures. It reveals how easily those seeking help, often desperate, vulnerable, and unheard, can become targets for exploitation by individuals driven by ambition, control,